Hash sold as a wet nurse and kept in chains in a cellar. A cowboy broke the lock and gave her her own child. The chain was maybe 18 inches long. I know that because I measured it afterward, held it between my two fists and felt the span of it. The distance a woman was allowed to move in any direction from the iron ring bolted to the cellar wall. 18 inches, less than the length of my arm. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up to where it started, which was a Thursday in late October, cold coming early that year, and me riding into Caldwell with 3 weeks of trail, dust on me, and nothing on my mind but a bath. A meal that hadn't been cooked over an open fire, and maybe 2 nights in an actual bed before I pushed on south. That was all I was looking for. I want to be plain about that. I was not looking to get tangled in anyone's trouble. My name is Cutter Nance. I was 38 years old that October. I've been a drover most of my life, worked cattle from Texas up through the nations and on into Kansas more times than I could count, and I was in that stretch of a man's life where he's not young enough to think the trail is romantic and not old enough to have stopped doing it yet. I owned a horse and a saddle and a bedroll and a colt that I'd carried for 15 years. That was the sum of my holdings. I wasn't a hard man exactly, but I wasn't soft. I'd learned early that the world didn't particularly care about any given man's feelings on the matter of what was happening to him, and so I had trained myself not to spend a lot of time having feelings. That training would get undone that October, but I'm getting ahead of myself again. Caldwell was a cattle town trying to be something else, the way cattle towns do when the drives slow down, a few new storefronts, a church with fresh paint, a land office that had opened 2 years back and was doing some business. There was a saloon that also served food, which was where I went first. I tied Domino out front, went in, and ordered a plate and a beer and sat with my back to the wall the way a man does when he's been on the trail long enough to make that a habit he doesn't think about anymore. The man 2 tables over was named Hollis Pratt. I didn't know that yet. He was thick through the neck, 40 or so, with a face that looked like it had been put together out of leftover pieces from a larger face, everything too close together in the middle. He was talking to another man, the kind of talking where a man keeps his voice low but is still too loud, because he's used to being in a room where no one tells him to keep his voice down. He was talking about a woman. I didn't mean to listen, but the room was quiet and I was close, and the words arranged themselves in my ears without my permission. Had the baby 3 months back, still good for it. Prewitt's wife is feeding the boy herself now, but she wanted a spare and... The other man said something I couldn't hear. Hell, it's not. Prewitt paid good money and I've got papers on her. You want to see the papers? I've got papers. I ate my food and I thought about other things. Or I tried to. The trouble with having a conscience is that it is not a thing you can turn off the way you'd shutter a lantern. It sits there and it burns whether you want it to or not. I left some money on the table and I went to the bar and I ordered another beer and I said to the barkeep, a thin man with careful eyes, I said, "That man over there, Hollis Pratt." The barkeep looked at me for a second. "Gideon Pratt," he said, "lives 3 miles east, runs some cattle, does some other business." "What kind of other business?" The barkeep picked up a glass and polished it. He said very quietly, "The kind a man with papers does." I drank my beer. I should tell you something about the year. It was 1878. The war had been over for 13 years, but the law in Kansas was a flexible instrument in those days, applied in different ways to different people depending on who you were and who you knew and how much money was involved. What Gideon Pratt was doing had a name that predated the war and had not entirely died with it, though it had put on different clothes and carried different papers. I'm not going to use that name, but I want you to understand what I walked into. I rode out east on the road the barkeep had indicated, and I found the place just after dark, a low house with a barn and some outbuildings, 2 horses in the corral, lamplight in one window. I sat on Domino 100 yards out and I thought about what I was doing. Here is what I knew. I had no authority. I had no badge and no writ and no standing in law. I had no particular skills beyond what any man who'd worked cattle 30 years had. I could ride, I could rope, I could shoot straight, I could read weather and ground. I was one man. If Gideon Pratt had 2 or 3 hands on the place, things could go badly and go badly fast. Here is what else I knew. There was a woman in that house, or more likely under it, who was chained to a wall. I sat there for a while. The night was cold and the stars were very bright and Domino blew steam in the dark. I thought about what a man is, what he's for. I'm not a man given to philosophy, but out there in the dark with that cold coming down, I thought, a man is for something or he's for nothing. There is no middle. Either what you do in the world matters or none of it does, and if none of it does, then you are already dead, just still moving around. I stepped down and tied Domino to cottonwood a quarter-mile off the road. I pulled my rifle from the scabbard and I walked in. There was no dog, which was lucky. There was a hand sleeping in the barn. I found him before he found me, which was luckier still. I don't want to make this sound like some kind of penny novel where the hero moves like smoke and no one ever hears him. I was not quiet. I was slow and careful, and I had the advantage of darkness and of the wind being in my face, and mostly I had the advantage of people not expecting trouble when they're on their own ground. I went around the back of the house. I was looking for a cellar door, and I found it. 2 flat doors set into the ground at an angle, padlocked with a lock that was heavier than it needed to be for a root cellar, which told me something. The lock took me 4 minutes with a cold chisel and a hammer from the barn. I was not quiet about it. I watched the house the whole time. No light moved inside. I got the lock off and I lifted one of the doors and I looked down into the dark. There was no smell of rot or mold. There was a smell I can't describe, something close and stale and human, and under it something that was soap or had been soap once. There were no stairs, just a ladder and a lamp down at the bottom with the wick turned almost all the way down so it gave about the light of a candle. And there was a woman. She was sitting against the far wall with her knees drawn up, wearing a gray dress that had been clean once. She was young, younger than I expected, maybe 22, 23, with dark hair loose around her shoulders and dark eyes that looked at me with absolutely no expression on her face. Not fear, not hope, nothing. The face of a person who has run out of the ability to expect anything in either direction. Her left wrist was chained to the iron ring in the wall. She didn't say anything. I came down the ladder and I crouched a few feet away from her and I said quietly, "I'm going to get that off your wrist. I need you to stay still and stay quiet. Can you do that?" She looked at me for a long time. Then she said very low, "Who are you?" "Nobody in particular," I said. "I'm just a man who's going to get that chain off your wrist." She said, "Why?" That stopped me. I'll be honest, I hadn't expected why. I'd expected relief or resistance, not a question. I looked at her and I said, "Because no one should be chained to a wall." She held my gaze for a moment and then she said, "My baby." "Where is your baby?" "In the house, he's in the house. If you take me without my baby, I won't go." Her voice was flat and absolute. She was not begging, she was stating a condition. "I won't make a sound and I won't fight you, but I will not leave without my son." I said, "All right." Her name was Miriam Cross, and she had been 21 years old when Gideon Pratt bought her papers from a man in Missouri who had forged them. Or possibly not forged them, depending on which judge you went before and what that judge had been paid. She had a husband, or had had one. He'd died of fever 6 months before their boy was born. She had no family left in the country and no money, and when the man from Missouri had told her he had worked for her, nursing work, and shown her papers she didn't fully understand, she had signed because she was hungry and 4 months along and had nowhere else to go. 3 months later, she was in a cellar in Kansas with a chain on her wrist, nursing a woman's baby she'd never met while her own son was in the house above her, fed just enough to keep him alive and keep her milk coming. I didn't learn all of this at once. I learned parts of it in the cellar and parts of it on the road and parts of it over the next few days, the way you learn a hard thing, in pieces, because a whole at once would be too much to hold. The chain ring was lagged into the wall with 3 big screws. I got 2 of them out with the blade of my pocket knife turned sideways, which took time and raised blisters on my thumb. The 3rd one I couldn't get, and finally I just leveraged the ring off the wall entirely, which made more noise than I wanted. I held still for 30 seconds. Nothing moved in the house. She stood up when the ring came free. She was a little unsteady, from sitting so long, I thought, and she caught herself against the wall with one hand and then straightened up, and she was taller than I expected, almost as tall as my shoulder, with a spine that was absolutely straight. That chain ring was still attached to the short length of chain still locked to her wrist, and she held it in her free hand so it wouldn't drag and make noise. She went up the ladder before I did, which surprised me. I'd half expected to have to help her to sort of tow her along, and she went right up and out into the cold night air without hesitating, and stood there with her face turned up for just a second, just 1 second, breathing, and then she looked at me when I came up after her and she said, "Back door." "You know the layout," I said. "I've been here since July," she said. "I know every floorboard." We went in through the back door of the house. It opened into a kitchen. She moved through the dark like she'd been born in it, touching the table edge once to orient herself and then going straight through the doorway on the far side. I followed her. We went down a hallway, past one closed door where I could hear Gideon Pratt snoring, and to a second door at the end. She opened it slowly, all the way to the stop so it didn't creak. Inside was a small room with a rope cot and a window and a wooden box on the floor that I understood after a moment was a makeshift crib, boards nailed together, lined with a folded blanket. She went straight to it and knelt beside it, and I heard rather than saw her lift something. And then she made one sound, just one, a single breath that wasn't quite a word, and pressed her face against whatever she was holding. I stood in the doorway, and I watched the dark, and I listened to Pratt snoring down the hall, and I let her have that minute. We were 2 miles from the house before I let Domino slow from a trot. Miriam was up in the saddle with the baby. I'd made a kind of cradle of her arms and my jacket wrapped around both of them, and I was on foot leading. The baby had not woken up. He was 4 months old, and he slept the way infants do when they're held, like something that has finally found the place it was always meant to be. She said from above me, "You came alone." "Yes." "Why would you do that?" I thought about it. "It needed doing," I said, "and there wasn't anyone else." She was quiet for a bit, then she said, "Are you a lawman?" "No." "Were you hired by someone?" "No." Another pause. "Then why?" she said, not suspicious, genuinely trying to understand, like the question mattered to her. I said I was in the saloon. "I heard that man talking about you like you were livestock, and it made something in me go cold, and then it made something in me go hot, and then I rode out here. That's the whole of it." She said nothing for a while. The night was very still around us, just the sound of Domino's hooves on the packed earth and somewhere far off a coyote saying something to the dark. Then she said, "What do I call you?" "Cutter," I said, "Cutter Nance." "Miriam Cross," she said, and then more quietly, "Thank you, Cutter Nance. I want to be honest with you about the next few days because I think men sometimes tell stories about things like this and make themselves out to be something nobler than what they actually were. I was not noble. I was scared, for one thing, scared of Gideon Pratt and whatever law he might be able to call on, scared of having done something I couldn't undo, scared of the look on that woman's face in the cellar that had told me she'd learned not to hope. And I was also, if I'm being straight, I was rattled in a way I hadn't been rattled in a long time. Not by the danger, by her. I want to be careful how I say this. It wasn't the soft kind of rattled, the kind a young man gets when a pretty woman looks at him. It was something older and harder than that. It was the feeling of having encountered something that the calluses you've built over the years don't quite cover. Miriam Cross had been through something that would have broken most people, man or woman, and she hadn't broken. She'd drawn her knees up in that cellar and held herself together with her own hands, and she had not broken. And I had helped her, and she had looked at me in the dark outside that house with her child against her chest, and something in me that had been sealed shut for a long time had opened slightly, like a door on a hinge that hasn't been used in years. Not all the way open, just enough to let some air through. I didn't do anything about that. I want to be clear. I had a job to do, which was to get her somewhere safe and figure out what came next. We rode into Caldwell before dawn. I knew a woman there, the wife of a man I'd driven cattle with, Vera Colston, a no-nonsense woman of 50 who ran a boarding house and had seen enough of life to not be surprised by much. I woke her up at 4 in the morning by knocking on her back door, which I had never done before and would not have done if I hadn't been desperate. And when she opened the door and saw me standing there with a woman carrying a baby and a chain ring still locked to her wrist, Vera Colston looked at all of this for about 3 seconds and then stepped back and said, "Come in, come in," the way a woman does when she's already decided the details don't matter. Vera got the chain off Miriam's wrist with a bolt cutter she kept in her shed. She didn't say why she had a bolt cutter, and I didn't ask. And she put Miriam in a room upstairs and brought food and hot water, and she told me to go sleep in the shed if I needed to. There wasn't a spare room. I slept in the shed. Gideon Pratt came looking for her, of course. That was the next problem. He came into town 2 days later. I knew because Vera's boy, a 10-year-old named Dale who seemed to know everything that moved through Caldwell, came to find me where I was helping Vera's husband repair a section of fence, and said, "Mr. Nance, there's a thick-necked man at the marshal's office asking about a runaway." I went to the land office first. Pratt had papers, I knew, papers of uncertain legitimacy on Miriam's labor, but papers nonetheless, and in Kansas in 1878 the right papers could make the wrong things legal. I needed to know what I was working with. The land agent, a small bespectacled man named Arbuckle who seemed to find the whole thing vaguely distasteful in the way of a man who knows something is wrong, but has been avoiding thinking about it, showed me what he knew about Pratt's arrangements. The papers, as he laid them out carefully on his desk, were a contract of indenture, signed in Missouri, binding one Miriam Cross to 7 years of domestic service in exchange for a debt of, here Arbuckle's voice dropped slightly, in exchange for a debt of passage and maintenance. The passage being from Missouri to Kansas, the maintenance being the period during which Miriam had been kept in a cellar on a chain. "Is it legal?" I said. Arbuckle took his glasses off and polished them. He said, without meeting my eyes, the contract was registered in Missouri under statutes that are, frankly, of questionable standing. Whether a Kansas court would honor it depends very much on which Kansas court. "And the chain," I said, "and the cellar." He put his glasses back on. He said, "Those details would certainly be relevant to any proceeding." I thanked him and I left, and I went to find the marshal. Marshal Ord Pettigrew was a man I had heard of but not met. A veteran of the war, about 50, rangy, with a face like cured leather, and the reputation of being neither corrupt nor particularly zealous, which in a cattle town in 1878 was about the best you could hope for. He was sitting on the bench outside his office when I came up, watching Gideon Pratt talk to his deputy inside through the window. I sat down next to him. I said, "Marshal." He said, "Drover." We sat there for a moment. I said, "That man in there." "MMHM. He had a woman in his cellar," I said. "Chained to a wall, her own baby was in the house above her. She was nursing his wife's child and not allowed to nurse her own." Pettigrew was quiet for a moment. He said, "And you know this how?" "Because I was in that cellar 2 nights ago," I said. "I got her out." He looked at me then. He had gray eyes, the color of November sky. He looked at me for a while, and then he looked back through the window at Gideon Pratt. He said, "He's got papers." "I know it. Papers aren't nothing in law." "No," I said, "but a chain ring bolted to a cellar wall is something too, in law, the kind of something that makes those papers look a lot less solid in front of a judge." Pettigrew sat with that for a while. He had his hands on his knees and he was looking at the middle distance. After a while he said, "The woman, she willing to speak to it?" "She is." "Her baby well?" "He is." Another long pause. Then Pettigrew stood up. He was a tall man when he stood. He said, "I'm going to need to talk to her." I said, "I can arrange that." He nodded once, very slow, the way a man nods when he's made a decision that's going to cost him something. He went inside and I stayed on the bench and I listened to the conversation shift inside, the tone of it, not the words. And I heard Pratt's voice go from the high confident register of a man who expects to get what he came for down to something lower and less certain. And I watched through the window as Pettigrew put his hand on Pratt's arm and walked him, not roughly but firmly, toward the door that led to the cell at the back. The hearing was a week later. I want to skip over some of the week, because some of it was legal and dull, and some of it was things I don't fully understand to this day about what the law was and wasn't in 1878. And men who know more about that than I do have written it down in places where you can find it. What I will tell you is this. Miriam Cross stood in front of a county judge in a borrowed dress with her baby in her arms, and she told what had happened to her, and she told it plain, and she told it straight, and she did not cry, and she did not beg, and she looked that judge in the eye the whole time. I sat in the back of the room, and I watched her, and I thought, this woman. I thought it more than once that week in different ways. The first time was the morning after I'd brought her to Vera's, when I came in from the shed and found her in the kitchen feeding the baby, and she looked up and said, "Good morning, Cutter Nance," the way a person says good morning to someone they've known for years, easy and plain, like she'd already decided I was not a threat. The second time was when Dale, Vera's boy, brought her a posy of brown October wildflowers he'd found God knows where, and she thanked him with such genuine seriousness, treating his small gift like it was the most significant thing that had been offered to her in months, that he went red from ear to ear and stammered something and bolted. The third time was when I told her what Arbuckle the land agent had said about the papers, about the questionable standing, and she said, "He kept me in a cellar on a chain. That's the whole truth of it. I'll say so to any judge anywhere." Like the law was a thing she was going to make work correctly by sheer force of will. I thought this woman, and I couldn't get past that. I didn't know what to do with it, so I just kept working, fixing Vera's fence, doing what I could around the place in exchange for room and board, making sure Miriam had what she needed. We talked in the evenings sometimes, after the baby was down. Vera gave us the kitchen to ourselves, and we'd sit at the table with coffee and the lamp turned low and talk about where she'd come from, about the husband she'd lost, about what she'd done before all of this, which was teach school in a small Missouri town, which explained the way she spoke. About what I'd done, which was mostly cattle, and she asked questions about it the way a person does when they're genuinely curious and not just making conversation. She wanted to know about the trail, what it smelled like, what you ate, what you talked about around the fire at night, whether the grass really went on forever in every direction the way she'd heard. I told her it went on pretty far. Not forever, but far enough that on a clear day you could almost believe it. She said, "That sounds like something." I said it was. She looked at her coffee for a while and then she said, "What do you want, Cutter? In your life, I mean, what do you want?" Nobody had asked me that in a long time. I thought about it seriously, the way the question deserved. I said, "I don't know that I've thought about it in those terms for a while. I've mostly been thinking about the next drive, the next place. Getting from one thing to the next." She said, "And before that?" "Before that, I was young enough to think the thing I wanted was just more of whatever I already had," I said, "which is mostly how young men think." She smiled at that, the first real smile I'd seen from her, and it changed her whole face, something that had been held in reserve letting go for just a moment. She said, "Men aren't the only ones guilty of that." The judge ruled in her favor. This is not as simple as it sounds. Gideon Pratt had a lawyer, a man from Wichita who was very smooth and very sure of himself, and who argued for 2 hours about the legal standing of the indenture contract, and the precedent in Missouri, and the question of what constituted reasonable conditions of service. The judge listened to all of it with his chin in his hand, and the expression of a man who is hearing words he has heard before and found tedious. Then Miriam Cross stood up and said, quietly, "He kept me in a cellar on an 18-inch chain while my baby was in the house above me. That is what happened. That is all I have to say." There was a silence in the room. The judge said, "Contract void. Woman free. And Mr. Pratt, I would strongly recommend that you remove yourself from this county within the week, as I find myself struggling to recall precedent for the charges that might otherwise be brought against you, and I would not like to have time to remember." Gideon Pratt left Caldwell the next day. I was waiting outside the courthouse when Miriam came out. She had the baby on her hip. He was 4 months old, and he'd put on weight in a week, and he looked at everything around him with the startled, interested expression of a person who has recently realized that the world is very large. She came down the steps, and she stopped in front of me, and she looked at me for a long time. She said, "Cutter." I said, "Miriam." She said, "I don't have anywhere to go." I had been thinking about this. I'd been thinking about it for most of the week in the spare spaces between one task and the next. I said, "I know a place, down in Texas near the Brazos. A man I drove cattle with for 10 years has a small ranch there. He's been after me for 3 years to come partner with him." I kept putting it off because there was always another drive to run. I stopped. I said, "It's a good piece of ground, good water, room to build." She looked at me steadily. She was very still. She said, "And what would I be on this piece of ground?" I said, "That would be up to you. I'm not trying to put you somewhere without your say. If you wanted to go somewhere else entirely, I'll help you get there. But if you wanted to come south to start somewhere clean, you and the boy," I stopped again. "That offer stands for as long as you need it. That's all I'm saying." She was quiet for a moment. The baby grabbed a handful of her hair and she detached his fingers with practiced gentleness without looking away from me. She said, "And you? What do you want?" She had asked me that before and I hadn't known the answer. Now I did. I said, "I want to stop being a man who's just getting from one thing to the next." I said, "I want to stop sleeping in other men's sheds." That got a small sound out of her that might have been a laugh. She said, Texas. I said, Texas. She looked down at the baby for a moment, then back up at me. She said, all right, but I'm not a woman who gets told what to do, Cutter Nance. I'm not going to pretend I am. I said, I haven't gotten the impression you'd pretend to be anything. This time it was definitely a laugh, quiet but real. We rode south. It took us 3 weeks, which is longer than it should have, but a man is not going to push hard on a trail when he's riding with a woman and a 4-month-old baby. We took it easy. We camped early and broke late, and I cooked. I am not a good cook, but I am adequate, and Miriam fed the baby, and in the evenings we talked by the fire the way we had in Vera Colston's kitchen. Easy, like two people who have been traveling together for years. The baby's name was Thomas, Tom for short. He was, in my experience, an unusually cheerful infant. He seemed to find the entire world deeply interesting, including me, which I found vaguely humbling. He had Miriam's dark eyes and her habit, already at 4 months, of looking at you very steadily when you talked to him, like he was taking careful notes. About a week into the ride, one evening after Tom was down and we were on opposite sides of a small fire, Miriam said, "Can I ask you something?" I said yes. She said, "What made you come out there that night? The truth, not the answer you gave me on the road." I thought about it. I said, "The truth is I heard that man talking and something went cold in me and then hot, and I told you that. But the deeper truth, if you want it, is..." I stopped. "I've been a man alone for a long time. It sounds like something to say it out loud, but I've been invisible for a long time. Not to other people exactly, just to myself maybe. Going from drive to drive and nobody needing anything particular from me that another man couldn't provide. And I heard that man talking about you, and something in me said, this you can do something about. This is a thing that matters, maybe the first thing that's mattered in a while." She looked at me across the fire. She said, "That's a lonely thing to say." "I suppose it is." She was quiet for a minute, then she said, "I know what it is to be invisible. I spent 4 months in a cellar that a whole town was pretending not to know about." She paused. "That is not the same thing as what you mean, but I understand the shape of it." I said, "I know it's not the same." She said, "No, but..." She stopped and she looked at the fire. "You were not invisible to me, Cutter. From the first minute you came down that ladder, you were the most visible thing I'd ever seen. This stranger in the dark who was going to take a cold chisel to my chains because he'd heard some man talking in a bar and it had made him cold and then hot." She almost smiled. "That is not an invisible man." I didn't say anything. I didn't have anything to say. I just sat with that, with being seen, clearly and plainly, by this woman across a fire in the middle of the Texas grass, and felt the thing in me that had been sealed for a long time open just a little further. Frank Aldis's ranch was on the Brazos, a wide piece of ground with good grass and a creek that ran clean. Frank himself was 55, weathered down to wire and sinew, and when we rode up he came out of his house and looked at me and then at Miriam and then at Tom in Miriam's arms and then back at me. And he said, "Well, Cutter, you have arrived at last and you have brought complications." I said, "Frank, this is Miriam Cross. She needs a place and so do I." Frank looked at her steadily. She looked back at him with the same direct, unreadable gaze she'd given the judge. He said, "You know anything about running a ranch?" She said, "I know how to teach school, mend anything, keep accounts, preserve food, doctor animals in a pinch, and shoot straight enough. If you tell me what else is needed, I'll learn it." Frank looked at her for a moment more. He said, "I've been waiting on this man for 3 years, meaning me." He said, "I've got a smaller house I built for a foreman I never quite found, sits empty on the west pasture. It's not much, but it's solid." Miriam said, "That's more than I had last month." Frank nodded. He said, "Welcome to the Aldis Nance spread then, I suppose." He looked at me again with an expression that said a lot of things without saying any of them, and then he went back inside. The smaller house was 1 room, solid as Frank had said, with a stone fireplace and 2 windows and a good roof. We spent the first 2 weeks making it right. I rebuilt the floor where 2 boards had gone soft, and Miriam cleaned it front to back and put up curtains she sewed from flour sacks dyed blue, and Tom slept in a drawer lined with blankets while we worked. It was October still, going to November. The nights were cold and clear. We worked in the daytime and ate supper together, and after Tom was down we'd sit by the fire and sometimes talk and sometimes not, and it was, I want to get this right, it was the most settled I had felt in as long as I could remember. Not because I was in love with her, though that was coming. I could feel it the way you feel weather coming, a kind of pressure in the air. but because I was needed. Because there was a place that needed my hands, and a woman who trusted my judgment, and a child who looked at me with those solemn dark eyes, like I was the most interesting thing in the visible world. I had been a man just getting from one thing to the next for a very long time. I was done with that now. It was a night in early November when things became what they became. We'd been at the ranch about 3 weeks. Frank had ridden into town and wasn't back yet. Tom had gone down early. We were by the fire in the small house, and Miriam was mending a shirt of mine by the lamp. She did this sometimes, mended things without being asked. The way a person who has been good at caring for things all her life falls back into that without thinking. And I was looking at her, not carefully enough, because she looked up and caught me looking and held the look instead of letting it go. She said, "Cutter." I said, "Miriam." She set the shirt down. She looked at me for a long time with those straight, dark eyes. She said, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." I said, "All right." She said, "When you got me out of that cellar, and then helped with the hearing, and then brought me south when you offered all of that." She paused. "Was it charity?" I said, "No." She said, "Because I'm not a woman who wants to be someone's project cutter. I'm not a woman who wants to be the cause a good man took on. I've been told I'm someone to be rescued, and I am very done with that." I said, "I know it." She said, "Then what is it?" I thought about what she'd said to me across the fire a few weeks back, that I was not invisible to her. I said, "You asked me once what I wanted in my life. I told you I wanted to stop getting from one thing to the next. I said, what I want is this room and this fire and you sitting there mending my shirt and Tom in the drawer asleep." I stopped. "I want to be the man you trust, not because you have to or because there's no one else. Because you think I'm worth trusting." She was very still. I said, "I know that might not be what you want. I know you've had a damned rough go of it, and the last thing you might want is to have a drover with nothing to his name making." "Cutter," she said. I stopped. She got up from her chair and she came and sat beside me on the bench by the fire, close enough that her shoulder was against my arm, and she looked at the fire for a moment and then she looked at me. She said, "You are the worth trusting. I decided that a long time ago. I just needed to know if you knew it about yourself." I didn't say anything. She said, "I'm not a woman who came south with you because I had nowhere else to go. I went where you offered because you were where I wanted to be. Those are different things." I said, "They are." She leaned her head against my shoulder, just a small thing, just that much, her head against my shoulder and the fire throwing light across both of us. And I put my arm around her, and she settled into my side, and Tom breathed in the drawer across the room, and the wind moved outside, and I thought, all right. I thought this is what I was moving toward, all those drives, all those seasons, all that getting from one thing to the next. This was the thing I was getting to without knowing it. We were married in the spring by the circuit preacher, who came through every 6 weeks. Frank Aldous stood up with me and Vera Colston, who had come down for a visit she'd been threatening since October, stood up with Miriam. And Tom, who was 8 months old by then, and had recently discovered the concept of walking along furniture while holding on with both hands, regarded the whole ceremony with the judicious calm of a man evaluating a business arrangement. It was not a large wedding. There was food after at Frank's house, and some of Frank's neighbors came, and someone had a fiddle. I am not a man who dances, but Miriam is, and I stood and watched her dance in Frank Aldis's front room with the lamplight on her and Tom on her hip, laughing at something someone had said, and I thought, look at her, just look at her. I thought, this woman chose to be here. She is here by her own will and her own choosing, as free as she has ever been, and she chose me. I had been invisible for a long time. I was done with that. The ranch is called the Nance place now, after Frank passed and left it between me and his nephew, who was a good man but wanted to try California, and so I bought out the nephew's share, and now it's mine and Miriam's and Tom's. Tom is 11 and can ride and rope both, though his mother is a better shot than either of us and is not modest about it. We have 2 more children, girls, 8 and 5, both with their mother's dark eyes and her way of looking at you like you are being carefully evaluated. The cellar behind the house where we keep root vegetables, I rebuilt it 2 years after we settled. New walls, good drainage, a shelf system Miriam designed. I put a proper door on it with a good latch, the kind a person opens from either side. I keep the chain in a box in the barn. I don't look at it often. But sometimes, maybe once a year, I'll go in there and I'll open the box and I'll hold it in my hands, that 18-inch span of it, and I'll feel the weight. And I'll think about a Thursday in October in a saloon in Caldwell, Kansas. A man talking about a woman like she was livestock and something going cold in me and then hot. I'll think about a cellar and a ladder and a woman in the lamplight who looked at me with nothing on her face at all, no fear and no hope, and said, "Who are you?" And I'll think about what I said, nobody in particular. I'm just a man who's going to get that chain off your wrist. That's what I was when I walked down those stairs, nobody in particular. I'm something in particular now. Miriam made me that. Every morning she gets up before the girls and she makes coffee and she sits at the kitchen table with the first light coming through the window and the whole house quiet around her, and she's just there, just in the kitchen, just herself. And there is something about that I will never stop being grateful for. Not grateful to some idea or some principle. Grateful to her, that she is here, that she chose this. That she looked at me in a dark cellar and then again across a campfire, and then again in a one-room house by a fire in November. And every time, she saw something worth staying for. I was a man getting from one thing to the next. I have been in one place now for 13 years. And every morning I wake up in the same bed, and there's a woman beside me who has never once let me be invisible. And I'll tell you something. That is everything. That is the whole of everything a man can hope for. And